All right, let us begin.
Great, let's get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Vanessa Beschorner. I'm a parent and educator and the creator of Tutor Chest. Tutor Chest is an educational platform that connects parents and educators, offers resources, events, and workshops. Tutor Chest is a proud sponsor of the free webinar series for school districts and teachers. So in the 2022-23 school year, the Department of Elementary Education at Minnesota State University Mankato has been providing free monthly webinar sessions for teacher professional development. We'll be posting a link throughout this workshop where you can go to receive your CEU credit. Tonight's workshop, using action assessment projects to advance racial equity in professional learning communities. Presenting this information is Dr. Beth Beschorner. She is a professor and department chair in elementary education. Dr. Beschorner works with teacher educators and teacher candidates to develop the next generation of educators. She provides an exceptional teacher preparation program focused on advancing equity and innovation in education. She has published approximately 20 peer-reviewed articles, several book chapters, and conducted more than 30 national presentations. And she holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction from Iowa State University. Thank you, Dr. Beschorner, for being here today and sharing your time and expertise with us.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate it, and I'm excited to be here with everyone this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. As Vanessa stated, tonight's presentation is entitled Using Action Assessment Projects to Advance Equity. So I know Vanessa introduced me and told you a little bit about me, but I wanted to provide just a little bit more background information about myself before I get started. Again, my name is Beth Beschorner. I hold a PhD from Iowa State University. I'm a professor and department chair at Minnesota State University, Mankato, within the Elementary Literacy Education Department. A little bit more about me outside of work. I like to read, I like to exercise, and I like to spend lots of time at my kids' events. So excited to be here with you this evening. So I'm going to start this evening with something that is known as a grounding. And in the College of Education at Minnesota State University, Mankato, we often use a grounding as a way to start a meeting, start our work together, to sort of center our attention on the work that we're about to do. And so I'd like everyone to participate in this grounding to give you a sense of what this type of activity might be like, because you will hear about it later in the presentation. So you get to experience it before I talk about it later. So in today's grounding, what I'm going to ask you to do is pull out a piece of paper or something to write with or on. So it can be digital or it can be paper. And once you have something to write with or to write on, I'm going to have you write the first things that come to your mind when I show you 4 different words. Perhaps those things might be your best attempt at a definition of those words. So we'll start with 1. The first word that I'd like to give you just about 30 seconds to a minute to write about is the word race. So I'm going to actually start a timer so that I can keep us to the time. Please write your definition, the things that come to you when you hear the word race, and I'll give you a minute or so to do that. Okay, I'll ask you to stop there. And we'll move to the second word, which is racism. So again, I'm going to give you about a minute. If you can write your definition of the word racism or the first things that come up when you hear that word. All right, the next word, anti-racism. So again, I'll give you a minute. What is your own definition of that word, anti-racism? Okay, and the final word is actually a phrase, racial equity. So if you could spend a minute writing your personal definition of racial equity, or what comes up for you when you hear that phrase. Right, and I'll ask you to stop there. So there's a reason why I wanted to start by thinking about definitions of specific words, particularly related to race, racism, anti-racism, and racial equity. And that's because I've come to learn that oftentimes these types of words we might use in an educational setting, but different people mean different things. And so it makes it really hard to work together in small groups to address equity, racial equity issues within schools when we're not using consistent language, when one person is using a word in a different way than someone else. And so part of what's occurred at our institution in higher education is that two of our colleagues, Dr. Timothy Berry and Dr. Henry Morris,
Yes.
have actually created some working definitions for our institution so that we can refer to the definitions and know, okay, this is generally what we agree that this term means. And when we use it, we're using it in the same way so that when we address issues, we know that we're talking about the same things. So before I get started tonight, what I'd like to do to finish this grounding up is actually provide you with the definitions that we use at our institution for these four words. And my hope is that the background and definition of those words will help to frame the rest of the talk this evening. So the first word I asked you to write about was the word race. So here's the definition that we've agreed upon. And again, it's a working definition, which means we're constantly going back to it as we learn and read more and work together. So the definition that we have is that race is a social construct used to group people according to physical characteristics, for example, skin color. However, the definition also points out that biological studies show that there is as much variation within presumed racial groups as across racial groups. So there's no biological differences that equate to race. Race is this socially constructed idea. The second definition that I asked you to write about was this word racism. And this is the definition that we use at Minnesota State Mankato. We say that racism is ongoing violent systems of exclusion based upon that socially constructed idea of race. And racism is handed down through histories of oppression that are reproduced by conscious and unconscious interactions. So racism happens when people know, but also when they're doing things unconsciously. So racism can also be enacted at multiple levels simultaneously. So it can be institutional, it can be cultural, interpersonal, and individual. All of these definitions of racism are important. The third definition I asked you to categorize was the word anti-racism, which we define as working actively to identify, resist, and eliminate racism both formally and informally and in everyday interactions. So this might include working within one's own affinity group. So for me as a white woman, it might mean working with other white people, but it also means that it's working within historically white institutions in order to change racist systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes, so that resources can actually be redistributed and social power can then be shared equitably. And the final definition I'd like to provide for tonight is the actual term racial equity, which you're going to hear again later. This means the application of equity that works to produce equal outcomes by race. So there's lots of different ways that we might consider equity, but racial equity actually centers race within the conversation. So a commitment to racial equity foregrounds race in order to interrupt those hierarchies of oppression and exploitation. So that is a grounding. A grounding is really meant to, again, elicit some thought. It is meant to center us all in the work that we're doing together. And it often generates conversation, discussion, and reflection. So you'll hear that term grounding again later. So what's the purpose of this talk? Well, there's really two purposes for this talk. First, I hope that you become familiar with the idea of action assessment project and you get familiar with what that process looks like. Second, I hope that you might consider identifying how the process of action assessment projects might actually be used within your own settings. So both getting to know the process, but then also thinking about how you might use the process within your own work is the purpose for this talk. So let me give you a little bit of background information about action assessment projects. So part of the work that I do is I work in a place called the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. That is a unit at Minnesota State University Mankato that provides support for faculty and staff at the university to improve teaching and learning. And my job there is the Associate Director for Equity Initiatives, which means that I'm specifically focusing on producing more equitable outcomes at the university in many different ways. So through course success, policies, and procedures. So within my work, when I started thinking about how do I actually do this work, and I'm imagining that many of you who are watching this are also thinking, within my work, how do I really make sure that outcomes are not predictable by race, that we can't imagine who is likely to do well and who is likely to not do as well? How can we make changes to those patterns? So as I started thinking about that at our institution, I worked with a colleague of mine, Dr. Heather Camp, and we had lots of conversations about how it's very necessary to make sure that educational development, professional development is embedded within the job that we're actually doing, that it's connected to the work that we're doing and not disconnected, and that it's collaborative, that folks have an opportunity to work with one another as they learn and seek to make sure that the outcomes within their individual courses, within their programs, and then at the university more broadly are equitable outcomes, that we can't predict them again by race. So what we came up with is that we also, in addition to making sure that these opportunities for professional learning were collaborative and job embedded, we also knew that we wanted to focus on two things. And we wanted to focus on knowledge building, making sure that people had opportunities to learn new things, particularly related to race. And then we also wanted to make sure that a component of the professional learning was actually taking action. So often we had participated in workshops and learning opportunities, which were great, but they really stopped at the self-reflection level. They stopped maybe at the knowledge level. And we never quite got to the step where we could say, okay, what can I do with this knowledge to actually take some action and perhaps make some changes that would have positive consequences, positive outcomes for the students in our spaces. So what we came up with was this idea of action assessment projects. So what is an action assessment project? Well, again, an action assessment project is this job embedded. And for us in our space in higher education, it's department specific. In a K-12 setting, that might mean grade level specific. It might mean content specific. But there's something that brings a small group of people together, right? So it's job embedded, it's specific to this particular small group of people. So it's a type of professional development that allows faculty or the people in the group to identify goals that aim to advance. In our space, that's Equity 2030. Equity 2030 is a position statement made by Minnesota State that is working toward ensuring that by the year 2030, there are not predictable outcomes in a number of areas, but one of those areas is that there are not predictable outcomes for students by race. So in our setting, the purpose of the action assessment project is that folks will undergo some job embedded department specific professional development that then works toward achieving the goal that by 2030, there will not be predictable outcomes by race within our setting. In a K-12 setting, an action and assessment project can still be job embedded, can still be department or context specific, still a space for learning that allows the people in the group to identify goals that advance equity more broadly, or perhaps more specifically, if the district or school has specific goals related to equitable outcomes for students. So there's a couple of things that are really important to recognize about how an action assessment project actually takes shape. So first, an action assessment project should always occur in a small professional learning community. Part of the power of the approach of working together in a small group is it provides an opportunity for dialogue. It provides people a space to really think and reflect with one another. And it ensures that the goals of the project are really driven by the people in the group. That's one of the really important parts about an action assessment project is the people in the space should be the ones that are driving the direction of their professional learning and the action that they take at the end of the project. Second, a key feature of providing an action assessment project or producing an action assessment project is that it should be aligned with the very unique needs and priorities of the group. Again, this can be achieved when you have a small group of people who determine their own course of action. So what does this look like? How does it actually take shape? Well, action assessment projects, generally speaking, take approximately 7 or 8 meetings. There might be some other types of projects that might take a longer period of time in certain steps. So generally speaking, however, there are 3 kind of components of the way that those 8 meetings take shape within the small group. So the first 1 or 2 meetings are really meant to set a goal. The group has to decide, what is it that we are trying to achieve? They have to think about what it is that in their particular setting might really influence better outcomes, more equitable outcomes for students. The second part, after the group has determined what their goal is going to be, the second part that they undergo, this takes the bulk of the project, is this information gathering stage. This can look a lot of different ways. I'm going to provide some examples within the next couple of slides, but I'll give you an example here that's different than those 2 slides. So I worked with a department, and again, this is in a higher education setting. They were really interested in understanding the ways that their students experienced their program. And they were really interested in taking a look at how those experiences might be different based upon a number of the students' a number of aspects of the student's identity. So what happened is they developed this goal to understand student experiences with a particular focus on race and gender identity, so that the faculty members in the group kind of understand those experiences and think about the ways that those experiences were contributing to either success or lack of success broadly in the program over time. So what they decided is we have to actually ask our students about their experiences. So their information gathering stage was actually creating a survey that asked students about a wide range of experiences within their program. And you can imagine that this information gathering stage took approximately 5 to 6 meetings. We had to develop the survey questions, which took some time. We had to think about the logistics of how we were going to give the survey, of how we were going to get information back, and then what we were going to do with the results. We also had to actually do the data analysis, right? We had to take a look at what we learned and we had to make sense of it. This took a significant number of meetings. The last step in the timeline for an action assessment project is actually to figure out what to do with the information that was gathered that will produce an anti-racist outcome, right? What are the ways in which the information can be used to make changes to policies, to procedures, to curriculum, to any number of aspects of the student's experience within the program so that they can have different results. And so this actually, there was a number of things that this particular department ended up doing as a result of the information that they gathered within that second stage. They ended up producing a workshop for their other faculty members that were in their department. And they shared a lot of the information that they learned, in addition to some other information that they had about their student experiences, to create a robust opportunity for the entire department to think about curricular changes. They also created a number of resources that their students could use to better take advantage of many of the different supports that are offered on campus that were specifically connected to the information that they learned in the information gathering stage. So again, the goal setting part of this process takes 1 to 2 meetings. The information gathering part takes probably 5 to 6 meetings, and then you've got 1 to 2 meetings where you figure out, okay, what are we going to do with this result, with the results of the information gathering. It can take longer. I imagine it could probably take a shorter time if it were a smaller project. But I think that in order to actually go through this process of professional learning together, it probably really does take at least close to the 7 or 8 meetings to get through the entire process. So each session also had a format that fell within that timeline. And this is where that grounding piece comes back in. So the format for each of the sessions was that the facilitator of the group, and that can take shape in a lot of different ways. You can have one person be a facilitator, or you can, kind of think about sharing that responsibility of facilitation. But one person started off each of the Action Assessment Project meetings with a grounding. And the grounding was just a short activity that can build knowledge. And the grounding was often a video, a poem, a phrase, a resource that everyone could read or listen to. And then the grounding also often included a reflection or an opportunity for people to co-construct ideas. So through discussion. So there was some time provided to engage with the activity, but then also to talk with one another about the activity. Groundings are where lots of things happen. Number one, because the grounding was often connected to the overall purpose of the Action Assessment Project, it really set some foundational knowledge for the group, focused everyone, but also provided thought-provoking resources to be able to think about the rest of the meeting. But it also provided a space for people to share their own lived experiences related to whatever the content was, which built relationships, but also built empathy, understanding, and community amongst the participants in the Action Assessment Project. So the grounding is really a key piece of this approach, and it really needs to be kind of well thought out. Because it is an important component, again, of the knowledge building part. Groundings generally took between probably 10, 15 minutes, but I really tried to think about the value of sometimes having a grounding that lasted longer. There were times when the group just needed to engage more deeply with a particular activity. And I tried to listen to the group and get a general sense of how we best needed to spend that time. Generally speaking, though, around 10 or 15 minutes of just grounding in Then moving on, the bulk of the session was spent on facilitated focused discussion that worked specifically toward the goal. So if I go back to that example that I provided when I was talking about the timeline of the ways the sessions worked, that work session is really meant to move toward the goal. So the work session, as we were defining the goal, obviously was a lot of conversation about what's really important to us as a department. What are we moving toward? Where are our kind of sticking points where we really need to learn more about what's happening in our educational space. But then when we moved into the solid work time, this work session was spent really developing survey questions, giving each other feedback. It was spent digging into the data that we had collected and thinking about the meaningful information that we had learned and having deep discussions about what that really meant for the people that were working with these students every day. And the last part of each session was spent planning for that next session. So this is another, I think, part that you just cannot understate the importance of, because a plan is really necessary to make the most out of every single meeting and continue to advance the work forward. So we would end our conversation in our work session, and then we would think, what are the things that have to be accomplished before the next meeting? Who is going to do those things? How is that work going to get finished? How are we going to distribute this work? And then what are we going to do the next time we get together? So it was really purposeful in determining the direction of the group and continuing to move the group forward. Because one of the things that I think I recognized as I was first doing these action assessment projects is that you can get stuck, right? You can get stuck in, thinking through how you're going to collect the information that you need, and without sort of continuing to move forward and think, what are we going to do before next time? The project itself can get lost. But when the group who's already doing a grounding together, who's doing this collaborative work, when they get together at the end of the meeting and say, okay, these are the things that we agreed to do before we come together again, it can help to advance the investment in the project by every single person that's involved, and continue to move that work forward. So I'd like to give you a couple of examples that are a bit different than the one that I shared as I was sharing the timeline for an action assessment project. And again, both of these examples do take place in higher education, but I'm hopeful that they might spark they might be thought-provoking for the ways that a similar type of project might be relevant in a K-12 space. So again, there's 3 phases to the project. We're goal setting, then we're gathering information, and then finally we're taking anti-racist action. So in this first project, the people in the department, the faculty members in the department said, we really want to know about how well we're preparing our students to work with racially and linguistically diverse clients. Minnesota State University, Mankato, is a predominantly white institution that is in a predominantly white community. And so these particular faculty were really interested in ensuring that their students were prepared to work with racially and linguistically diverse clients. So once they had determined their goal, and it did take us a couple of meetings to really pinpoint what the goal was, we had lots of conversations about, well, how are we going to figure out what the answer to that question is? And so the first stage was the group worked together to create a survey. And they created that survey by looking at their program learning outcomes and asking themselves, what is it that we want to know particularly to our program learning related to our program learning outcomes in regard to, again, preparing students to work with racially and linguistically diverse clients. So they conducted the survey, they got the information back from the survey, and they learned a lot. But what they recognized is we still don't quite know everything we want to know. It actually made them ask some more questions, right? Because they were like, oh, these results are really interesting. Now we want to know, how is this actually happening? The ways that what they're reporting, how would they describe it? How would they talk about it? So they decided that they were really interested in doing a second sort of information gathering phase that involved implementing a focus group, a series of focus groups, so that the students could talk more deeply about their experience. So at the end of the information gathering phase, faculty had both quantitative information that student survey had produced, and they had qualitative information that focus groups had provided. And so at the end of this information gathering phase, we had a lot of conversation about the meaningfulness of that data. And they decided that they were going to take action in a number of ways. Number one, they said this information is too valuable for us just to share in our smaller group. We need to share it with the rest of our department, and we want to talk to the college about two things. Number one, what we learned about our students and their experiences within our program, their preparation. But number two, about this process of an action assessment project, we think the college might be interested in thinking about how they can do similar sorts of projects. So they decided they were going to do presentations in both of those spaces. Number two, they knew that they had work to do in this area, but they developed a plan to ensure that students did receive clinical placements with racially and linguistically diverse clients. So it was a renewed commitment and continued action toward really thinking about their clinical placements more deeply. And then finally, probably the most extensive action that they took was to think about the curricular changes that might be necessary to embed the content explicitly throughout their coursework. So some of their findings suggested that perhaps this was the best thing to do. They were finding that students were reporting that it was happening in some classes, but not as much in other classes. And so they committed to thinking about the ways to embed this throughout their program. So in a second example, in a higher education setting, another department is analyze their student handbook to ensure the use of inclusive language. They have an extensive handbook that they use with students. They really wanted to make sure that the language that they were using within that handbook was welcoming to students and was not using kind of coded language. So their information gathering section of meetings looked a little different than the first project. So one of the things that we started off by doing was becoming familiar with accreditation expectations. Again, the group was already knew that there were accreditation expectations, but diving into those with the lens of thinking about using inclusive language gave the group a focused intent toward looking toward those expectations. They had to do a deep dive into other materials within their department. So they had to take a look at other materials that were being used to make sure that there was consistency of language and that everyone in the department was familiar with why these tools existed, and that everyone in the small group was thinking about the potential unintended consequences of the way that the language and the tools were being used. Thirdly, they had to learn about the history and the purpose of the student handbook from senior faculty. So one of the things that was recognized is that we could go in and just make changes, but it's really important to understand the context and the use of this student handbook and understand, what are the considerations that we might need to attend to as we take a look specifically at the language. And then the other aspect of this information gathering phase was that quite a few of the groundings and then the work sessions were related to how the notion of professionalism can often be a code for whiteness and can be used to reproduce whiteness. And so that was part of the information gathering phase too, right? Was to think about the ways that this professionalism kinds of language could be used as a way to be exclusive rather than inclusive. So throughout this information gathering phase, the anti-racist action that occurred toward the end of the project was that significant revisions were made to the student handbook and to specific tools within the handbook that were used with students. So this is an idea of a very different way to approach an action assessment project that still falls within that same three-part structure of goal setting, information gathering, and taking action, and can also use that grounding, work session, planning for the next meeting sort of framework. So all of those examples that I have provided thus far have all taken place in a higher education setting. So I want to provide some examples of ways that I believe that the same structure might be useful for educators within PK-12 settings. So I definitely recognize as a former elementary education major that there are differences in context and setting. But I think that there are still, like I said, ways to use this structure effectively. So here are some examples that I came up with that might serve as high quality action assessment projects. Number one, definitely small groups could focus on doing an analysis of participation in programming. I think lots of districts are probably taking this up at a macro level and taking a look at who's participating in AP coursework, who's participating in talented and gifted programming, special education, just as a few examples. So much of this work might be done at the district level already, but imagine the possibility of a smaller group of teachers engaging with maybe a smaller set of data at the school level, perhaps at the grade level, to really have robust conversations about the data that's gathered and talk about perhaps the reasons why the data are the way that they are within a more local, smaller context than a broad district level conversation. So again, the conversation may be happening already at the district level, but within an action assessment project, we're talking about a small group of people who are learning through participating in groundings and work sessions together to engage in the process. So number two, my second thought was, can also be done on an analysis of a student performance on a specific task when disaggregated by race. So this could be as small as a group of teachers looking at results of a specific test. Maybe teacher created, maybe some other type of test that's given. Maybe it's all of students wrote a paper in a particular class. And it's taking a look at how students did on that specific task and really looking at what, if we disaggregate the data by race, what are the outcomes that we get, and how might that be influenced? What influence do we have? What action could we take if those results are predictable? What action could we take to make the outcomes less predictable? Third example, taking a look at student materials, at website, parent communication with a racially conscious lens. So an action assessment group could take a look at any number of products of content that is put out either by themselves as a grade level team, by a school perhaps, and take a look at what messages are we communicating, and how is that producing either inclusive or exclusive kinds of experiences. I believe that this type of project could also engage students. There could be data collection from students. There could be data collection from caregivers, from people who are actually receiving the information. So there's also this level of data gathering that could happen when you start to look at the materials that students are working with, that could be very informative when multiple perspectives of people that are interested in the outcomes of the school, but that are not intimately involved in the production of those materials, that might produce a lot of knowledge that could be very useful. Next idea, evaluation of curriculum materials with a racially conscious lens. So again, an action assessment project requires a small group of people. And to be able to take a look at curriculum materials and think about who's being represented, who's not being represented, who's being represented in what ways. And again, this is an opportunity to embed student voice, caregiver voice, community member voice in this analysis. And so part of the information gathering stage might be gathering perspectives from a wide range of people on the curriculum materials that are being used at a particular grade level, a particular school. I also think that it's beneficial for small groups to take a look at who's participating in extracurricular activities and why, who's not participating and why, what barriers exist to participation for whom. And again, the information gathering can happen in a wide range of ways, right? Where you're engaging the people that are most impacted or influenced by the procedures and policies related to extracurricular activities. And the final example project that I have listed is reflecting on hiring practices and what the outcomes of those hiring practices are. So in the state of Minnesota specifically, the field of teaching is predominantly white and predominantly female. This is also true nationally. It's even more intense in the state of Minnesota for people who live right around me. But there are conversations that are necessary to disrupt that narrative where we've got lots of white female teachers. So a reflection on hiring practices. And again, I think this may be happening in some spaces at the district level, but for smaller groups of people who are more intimately perhaps involved in the actual hiring process, they're doing the interviews, they're reviewing resumes, might be a really powerful action assessment project to really ask themselves, who are we hiring? Who are we not hiring? What is most valuable to us? And how can we learn more about the experiences of people within the hiring practices in a school community? There are any number of example projects. I could have continued to list other possibilities for ways that people might engage in action assessment projects in PK-12 spaces. These are just a few that are meant to hopefully provide seeds of ideas of ways that you might take up this same framework in your space. I know that we don't have lots of folks here right now, but I would like to just broach the question for reflection. Two questions, actually. Number one, how might action assessment projects be useful within your own context? So what are the ways that, as you heard me talk about what we're doing in higher ed, and then you heard me talk about the list of possibilities in K-12, what did this spark for you? What might you be able to do within your own space? And then second, who might that involve? So as you're thinking and answering that first question, who do you immediately think of that might be a person or group of people that would help support you in this work to get started with this action assessment project process? So thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope that it was thought-provoking and perhaps provided a framework to actually start to